Hi everyone, it's John. Happy Tuesday. Time for another book review. I don't really review a lot of books that have been recently published, in the past few years at least. Certainly not a lot of fiction. But I was walking around in Half Price Books the other day and saw a book by a journalist whose name I recognized and knew that she had previously won some awards, which I'll touch on in the review, and had heard about the book, and there were already a few copies in half price books. So given my interest and my that I hadn't read anything by her before, I sort of wanted to try it. It's called The Evangelicals: The Struggle to Shape America by Frances Fitzgerald. I thought this book actually won the Pulitzer Prize. It's that's not the case though. The fact is that her first book, which was on the subject of the Vietnam War, won the Pulitzer Prize. And as I'll mention also the Bancroft Prize for history. But this one just came out, I want to say, around the summer of last year, maybe springtime of 2017. And I'd never read it before, so I was curious. A bit of a chunky book, but was fun to read and was interesting. Embarking on a book like this can be a little emotionally enervating, even if your opinion isn't well formed enough about the topic to agree or disagree with the author's central thesis. Over the last couple of generations, American evangelicalism has become so intertwined with political conservatism, and especially the Republican Party, that the history of one is pretty closely connected to the history of the other. Worse yet, you can't be sure that the author doesn't have an axe to grind, or maybe even worse, a hagiography to craft or to write. Frances Fitzgerald, though, has gained a reputation as a well-respected journalist and historian whose Fire in the Lake, which is that book I was talking about the Vietnam War, won her both a Pulitzer Prize and a Bancroft Prize when it got published in 1972. It's hard to think that book is almost 50 years old. One can't accuse Fitzgerald here of lacking historical reach. Her narrative begins firmly in the 18th century, during the First Great Awakening. And there's about 750 pages in the book, the last 120 pages or so of which are footnotes, bibliography, indices, and an index. So there's about 630 pages of text, which are by no means evenly divided up historically. So by page 95, you're already in the 20th century. And by page 169, you're already at the career of Billy Graham, which is the early career of Billy Graham, albeit, which puts you in the 1940s, 50s. So while this book does historically acknowledge the roots of evangelicalism, it by and large speaks to the 20th century evangelicalism, and the figures and ideas within it. Some of the names that Fitzgerald discusses don't really fall into the decades where evangelicalism was especially politically influential, like before 1925, when the Scopes trial brought out Williams Jennings Bryan, who had been in retirement for a few years, brings him back into the public light to basically take up the mantle for what is basically biblical literalism and fundamentalism. Consequently, they get almost no contemporary attention, but they are mentioned in the book, and some of these figures are people like J. Frank Morris, J. Gresham Machen, and William B. Riley. I was especially grateful for the inclusion of two figures that were much more influential than the likes of Machen and Norris and Riley. And I'm sure people familiar with the religious history of the country will be more familiar with the names. But those two names are Francis Schaeffer and R.J. Rushdoony. I always forget the initials in front of his name. I just call him Rushdoony. If you are familiar, or if you are unfamiliar, by the way, with the name of Rushdoony, you should really look into his work beyond just the limits of what Fitzgerald gives you here. She gives him a bit of exposure. He's actually a really bizarre guy. Very intensely thoughtful, almost sort of coldly intellectual, very soft-spoken, but has super bizarre theological ideas. I wrote in my review of the book that I posted on Goodreads that his idea of a perfect society would have made the treatment of women in The Handmaid's Tale look like, sex-positive radical feminism. I mean, he has some very, very bizarre ideas. And one of those ideas, by the way, is to shape U.S. law after the Mosaic Penal Code. Yeah, that's right. To basically take all of the old Jewish laws in the Old Testament and to form a U.S. code, U.S. law around them. That's people in the United States in 2018 get called theocrats for doing a lot less than that. But he just comes out and says it. I mean, yeah, the U.S. law should be based on Old Testament law. I mean, it's bizarre. But to listen to him speak, he sounds like a very sort of rational, intellectual, like very professorial, but reaches some super bizarre conclusions. Anyway, I have a fascination with Rushdoony. Didn't mean to really get off on a tangent. You know he's a sincere guy, but it's just that he comes from another intellectual time and place. Obviously, about 3,000 years ago, actually, to be specific. But as conservative Protestant Christianity becomes more and more popular, you start to sense the rise of people joining the movement. But like I said, Rushdoony is a sincere character. I mean, he's not arguing in bad faith. I think he's wrong. I think almost everyone would admit that U.S. law doesn't need to be Mosaic law. But he's arguing in good faith. He actually believes what he's saying. I think as 20th century Christianity goes on, you start to see more and more people whose sincerity needs to be questioned. And you can almost feel Fitzgerald's blood pressure rising as she recounts biographies of increasingly conspicuous grifters and conmen, from Jerry Falwell to Pat Robertson to Jimmy Swaggart to James Baker, whose oleaginous behavior did little more than line their own self-serving pockets. Upon Falwell's death, Christopher Hitchens couldn't have been more right than to say the following: if they would have given him an enema, they could have buried him in a matchbox. One interesting thing about historical movements that seem to occur and reoccur is that only with sort of retrospection and some distance do they seem to have any degree of subtlety or complexity. In our own time, the slow evangelical creep that took over much of American conservatism seemed inevitable and unquestionable. It's only with a larger historical lens that we can really begin to get a grasp of the more defining characteristics that evangelicalism as a whole had in all of its reincarnations. All of the three Great Awakenings, or some historians count them as four. It all sort of depends on where you see the line breaks. And one of the definite weak points of the book is that, at least since the rise and appearance of the moral majority founded by Jerry Falwell in the 1970s, Fitzgerald assumes that the endpoints of American conservatism and evangelicalism are coterminous. But I don't really think that's the case. Consistent research actually shows that the average evangelical in the United States today is not the Supreme Court protesting, soldier funeral picketing Westboro Baptist Church member that you might envision from the book. By and large, evangelicals do tend to vote Republican by about 70 to 80%, but they don't really self-identify as activists in any greater proportion than any other religious demographic group does. Another group Fitzgerald doesn't mention is the emerging church movement, participants of which are not easily theologically classified, but tend to de-emphasize formal theology in favor of living just what they consider generally to be a moral, godly life. And the recognition and integration of postmodern elements, like the feeling of spiritual alienation and enemy that is so common, beginning in, around the 19th century in Western democracies and technocracies. While Fitzgerald admits to a kind of evangelical resurgence during the presidency of George W. Bush, she thinks it sort of lost its way in the light of the egregious failures that sort of surrounded his second administration, including the continued failure to wrap things up and to exit from Iraq, Hurricane Katrina, and the 2009 8-9 recession. But it's far from finished, I think she would say. It's just gone into one of its sort of intermittent, dormant, regrouping phases, awaiting to awaken again and vocally support a Supreme Court decision that illegalizes abortion, or supports a pagan president who thinks that Corinthians 2 is a kind of alternative car leather or something. The book isn't without significant oversights. For example, the African American evangelical experience and the Protestant religious coalitions that helped bring about the civil rights reforms of the 1950s and 60s are almost wholly elided from the book. But, all in all, it's probably one of the most fair, reliable, and thorough accounts of evangelical Protestantism that you'll be able to find for a general reader out there. So if any of that sounds interesting, and you happen to read it, by all means let me know what you think of The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America by Frances Fitzgerald. I'll see you hopefully next week on Christmas Day. Have a Merry Christmas.